What is carbon footprint, and how does it relate to the international supply chain?
What exactly is carbon footprint? Carbon footprint is the total amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases emitted over the entire life cycle of a product or service. This concept helps companies understand the amount of damage a particular product or service causes to the environment. The overall problem with this concept is figuring out how much responsibility a company bears for all of the carbon released by its value chain. Companies cannot avoid this problem, they simply just have to figure out the best way to minimize this issue. There are four factors that drive new interest in a more efficient supply chain. One would be the desire to cut energy costs, which would be rethinking the processes and sources of energy that they use. Two would be the concern about regulation. Now there are trading permits, and governments are putting on strong pressures for companies to reduce their carbon footprint. Three would be competitiveness. There are a growing number of consumers that favor companies that reduce their carbon impact. And four would be the desire to boost productivity. There are emissions reduction programs that can lower costs and improve operations.
CO2 emissions by transportation mode. Ocean freight produces the least amount of CO2 emissions at roughly 10 grams per kilometers traveled. Rail transportation produces the second least amount of emissions at 21 grams per kilometer. Road transportation produces more than double the amount of emissions of rail at 59 grams per kilometer. And finally, air freight produces the highest amount of emissions by a landslide, averaging 470 grams per kilometer. How can the supply chain reduce its carbon footprint?
Steps to consider in carbon reduction. The first step is understanding the carbon footprint of each product or service. Your focus should be on which kind of energy is consumed by those activities. The second step is separating necessary emissions from those that can be reduced. Finding out which energy expenditures are essential in the creation of a product. The third step is focus on measures that provide the best benefits for the cost involved. Weighing the alternatives using different analyses such as demand reduction and replacing energy sources. The fourth is local sourcing. In some cases, local sourcing is not the answer. If you have a company buying tropical fruit in a colder climate from a local farmer, is not actually a good thing. They need to buy from the tropical region where the fruit actually should be grown, because the carbon emissions from the greenhouse from the local farmer is hurting the carbon footprint.
The World Shipping Council and its member companies have engaged with the International Maritime Organization in efforts to reduce carbon emissions and further improve efficiency across the fleet. Action to reduce carbon emissions by the WSC and IMO. The IMO agreed in October 2016 to develop a comprehensive strategy for addressing GHG emissions from international shipping. The IMO data system will collect fuel consumption data from ships with annual reporting, allowing governments and stakeholders to accurately assess emissions generated by international shipping. The Energy Efficiency Design Index is a measure of the overall design efficiency of a given vessel. It was developed in 2011 by the International Maritime Organization as a tool for shipbuilders. Operational efficiency standards have proved difficult to implement because of weather variations, but steps forward include reducing vessel speed and sharing vessels with other ocean carriers. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the leading international body for assessment of climate change. The IPCC implications focus on industrial sectors that are at the front of the supply chain, primarily those that are energy intensive, such as mining, cement, iron and steel, chemicals, aluminum, and paper. One of the IPCC provisions was that an absolute reduction in GHG emissions by primary industries would require implementation of a broad range of sustainable supply chain strategies. Current events relating to carbon emission control and the international supply chain. The Paris Climate Accord. The Paris Climate Accord was the most recent agreement within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Its implications on the supply chain were that now many of the world's largest companies have embraced sustainability. In 2016, just 16% of the S&P 500 elected not to publish a sustainability report. This represents a global trend or bandwagon of companies approaching and engaging in sustainability. In particular, manipulating their end-to-end supply chain, which can be directly controlled to reduce carbon emission. A crucial outcome of the Marrakech Climate Conference was to move forward on writing the rulebook of the Paris Agreement. The conference demonstrated to the world that the implementation of the Paris Agreement was underway and launched the Marrakech Partnership for Climate Change.
Climate change agreements affect the international supply chain by turning it into a green and sustainable international supply chain. In order to comply with its purpose to provide a safe marketplace environment, it requires organizations to implement and maintain a time management and control over the supply chain operations and organizations. This gives clarity around the environmental impact of adjustments of the supply chain agility, flexibility, and cost in the supply chain.
Looking ahead. In conclusion, there are numerous and aggressive efforts being undertaken by key players in the international supply chain to reduce carbon footprint and slow the tide of climate change.